I've spent 36 years being invisible to my own family. So when I sat at that dinner table watching my mother's face twist into a smirk as I offered to help save our family's bankrupt company, I shouldn't have been surprised. But somehow the words still cut like glass. "You help with this," she laughed. Not cruelly, just dismissively, the way you'd laugh at a child offering to fix your car. "Honey, you can only afford small things." The table erupted. My brother Derek's chuckle, my aunt's pitying smile, the clink of wine glasses as everyone shared in the joke. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, felt my hands grip the napkin in my lap until my knuckles went white. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply stood, said, "Thank you for dinner," and walked out. They had no idea that in exactly 48 hours my face would appear on CNN, and everything they thought they knew about me would shatter. Have you ever been dismissed by the people who were supposed to love you most? My name is Megan Palmer. I'm 36 years old, a senior partner at Blackwell and Associates, one of the most respected private equity firms in the Midwest. I specialize in saving family businesses from collapse, which is ironic considering my own family never believed I could save anything at all. The drive from Chicago to my hometown takes about 4 hours if traffic cooperates. 4 hours of flat highway and farmland, 4 hours to think about why I was really making this trip. On the surface, I was going home for a family dinner, but the truth was more complicated. It always is with my family. I'd learned about Palmer Hardware's situation 3 days earlier when the file landed on my desk. Our acquisition team had flagged it as a distressed asset, a regional industrial supply company drowning in debt 6 months from bankruptcy. I'd stared at those numbers for a long time. The company my grandfather built, the company my father loved, the company that was now bleeding out under my brother's leadership. Derek had driven it straight into the ground. To understand my family, you need to understand one thing: my mother always wanted a son. When I arrived first, I was adequate, healthy, functional, but when Derek came 4 years later, with father's eyes and father's smile, he became the center of her universe. She used to say he was the spitting image of dad at that age. She never said what I looked like. I learned later that I resembled her mother, my grandmother, a woman she had complicated feelings about. Perhaps that explains some of it. Perhaps nothing could explain all of it. My father tried to compensate in his own quiet way, private words of encouragement, secret pride in my accomplishments, but he never confronted my mother directly. He chose family peace over fairness, harmony over justice. When he died 3 years ago, a heart attack sudden and final, I lost the only person in that house who truly saw me. And even he had never said it out loud when it mattered. Derek, meanwhile, received everything: a fully funded MBA at Northwestern, an immediate VP position at Palmer Hardware after graduation, the CEO title handed to him the moment father's heart stopped beating. He'd never had to earn anything. And now at 32, he was destroying a 60-year legacy with reckless expansion and hidden debts totaling $3 million. But here's what no one knows. 8 years ago, Palmer Hardware faced this same cliff. An $800,000 debt from a failed expansion nearly ended everything. Father was desperate, humiliated, unable to see a way forward. So I did something impossible. I mortgaged the Chicago apartment my grandmother left me. $350,000. I emptied my savings, $150,000 accumulated over 6 years of careful living. I added the $200,000 in cash she'd also left me, and I convinced Marcus Webb, Blackwell's founder, to personally loan me the remaining $100,000. I paid that debt anonymously through a shell company, asking nothing in return. Father discovered the truth 3 months later when he traced the payment through bank records. He wept when he called me. He told Harold, his assistant of 25 years, and swore he would tell Mother everything. But weeks passed, then months. The right moment never seemed to arrive. And then his heart gave out, and the truth was buried with him. I never told anyone else. I thought it was enough that he knew. Now, as I drove toward home with CNN set to broadcast my $100 million deal in 2 days, I wondered, would this time be different? Would they finally see me? Part of me already knew the answer. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that my brother had spent 8 years making sure they never would. I arrived at the family home just as the sun was setting, painting the old farmhouse in shades of gold that made it look warmer than it ever felt inside. The same wraparound porch, the same squeaky third step, the same feeling in my stomach that I was walking into a place where I had never quite belonged. Mother greeted me at the door with a hug that lasted exactly 2 seconds. The same hug she had given me my entire life. Polite, adequate, nothing more. Derek appeared behind her, and I noticed something flicker across his face when he saw me. Not surprise exactly, something more like alertness. He recovered quickly, offering his usual half smile and a comment about Chicago traffic. The house was full of relatives I saw once or twice a year. Aunt Patricia with her endless questions. Cousin Brian, who still treated me like we were teenagers. Uncle Robert, who fell asleep in the corner armchair before dinner was even served. They all greeted me with the same vague pleasantness, the kind reserved for distant acquaintances rather than family. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, a space reserved for holidays and occasions that demanded the good china. The table was beautiful, covered in white linen and candles, but the atmosphere underneath was brittle. Everyone was trying too hard to be cheerful. The company crisis hung over everything like smoke no one wanted to acknowledge. Aunt Patricia turned to me about halfway through the main course. "Still at that little consulting firm in Chicago, dear?" I smiled and said yes, keeping it simple. I had stopped correcting people years ago. There was no point explaining what I actually did, the scale of deals. I handled the businesses I had saved. They had already decided who I was. A woman with a little job in a big city doing something vaguely related to business that no one quite understood or cared to ask about. The conversation drifted as it always did toward Derek. His plans for the company, his vision for the future, his challenges with the current market. Mother beamed at him as he spoke, nodding along to every word. I watched her face and wondered if she had ever looked at me that way. I could not remember a single time. When Derek finally paused, someone mentioned the difficulties Palmer Hardware was facing. Not a crisis, of course. Just challenges. Just a rough patch. Just temporary setbacks that would resolve themselves once the market turned around. I listened to the careful words, the deliberate vagueness, and I knew exactly how bad it really was. $3 million in hidden debt. 6 months to bankruptcy. A company my grandfather built with his own hands circling the drain because Derek had expanded too fast into markets he did not understand. I took a breath and spoke. "I work with struggling family businesses every day," I said. My voice was calm, measured, professional. "It is literally what I do for a living. I could connect you with restructuring specialists who have saved dozens of companies in similar situations. Or if you need immediate capital, I might be able to help directly." I paused, letting the offer settle. I have resources. I have expertise. I want to help. The table went quiet. I watched Mother's face, searching for any sign that she had heard me, really heard me. For a moment, I thought I saw something shift in her eyes. Then she laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. That might have been easier to bear. It was dismissive, gentle even, the way you might laugh at a child who offers to help you fix the car. "You help with this." She shook her head, still smiling. "Honey, you can only afford small things." Derek jumped in before I could respond, his voice carrying that rehearsed casualness I had heard 1,000 times. "Sis, I appreciate the thought, I really do. But this is a bit above your level. Let us not complicate things with amateur involvement. We have real professionals looking at this." Cousin Brian chuckled from his end of the table. "It is sweet that you want to help, though." The table laughed. All of them. Aunt Patricia, Uncle Robert now awake. The cousins I barely knew, even Mother still shaking her head with that indulgent smile. They laughed at me like I was a child playing dress-up, pretending to be something I could never actually become. I sat very still, feeling the heat rise to my face. My hands found the napkin in my lap and gripped it until my knuckles ached. I did not cry. I would not give them that. Instead, I looked at Derek. He was watching me, not laughing anymore, watching. There was something beneath his expression that I had never noticed before. Or maybe I had noticed and refused to see. He was not just enjoying my humiliation. He was monitoring it, measuring its effectiveness, making sure his words had landed exactly where he intended. And suddenly, a memory surfaced. 2 years ago, a conference in New York. I was delivering a keynote speech on family business restructuring, speaking to 300 industry professionals about the work that had defined my career. Halfway through my presentation, I spotted a familiar face in the back row, Derek. He was watching me intently, taking notes on his phone. When our eyes met across that crowded room, he looked away immediately. He slipped out before I finished, and I never saw him in the hallway afterward. I had told myself he was embarrassed, that he did not want to make a scene, that he was protecting both of us from an awkward encounter. Now, sitting at this dinner table with his laughter still echoing in my ears, I understood. He had not been embarrassed. He had been gathering intelligence, conducting reconnaissance, learning exactly how successful I had become, so he could go home and tell Mother the opposite, so he could shape the narrative before I ever had a chance. This was not ignorance. This was not simple jealousy. This was strategy. This was a campaign that had been running for years, maybe decades, and I had been the target all along. I stood up slowly, placing my napkin on the table with deliberate care. "Thank you for dinner," I said. My voice did not shake. My eyes did not water. I walked out of that dining room with my head high and my heart frozen solid. No one followed me. No one called my name. I drove back to Chicago that night in complete silence, not even turning on the radio. I was done being the silent sacrifice. Done hoping they would see me if I just tried hard enough. Loved hard enough, gave enough. They had made their choice. Now I would make mine. 2 days later, I was sitting in my Chicago office, reviewing acquisition files when my phone lit up with a news alert. CNN was airing the segment about my $100 million deal, the largest in Blackwell history, the achievement that had taken me 15 years to reach. I watched myself on screen speaking confidently about saving 200 jobs, about the future of family business in America. At that exact moment, 300 miles away, my family sat in the Palmer Hardware conference room, desperately negotiating with bank representatives who held their future in a manila folder. Derek's phone buzzed with the same alert. He glanced down at the notification, and according to what I learned later, his face went completely white. I did not witness what happened in that conference room 300 miles away, but I heard about it later, piece by piece, from Harold and from the bank representative, who became surprisingly talkative once he realized who I was. The story they told me was better than anything I could have imagined. The meeting with First Midwest Bank had been going poorly from the start. The bank wanted collateral that Palmer Hardware simply did not have. Derek was sweating through his pitch, throwing around projections and promises that even he must have known sounded hollow. Mother sat beside him, her presence meant to add gravitas, the matriarch standing behind her son. The bank representative was polite, but unmoved. He had seen 100 Dereks walk through his door, all of them convinced they could talk their way out of $3 million in debt. Then Derek's phone buzzed. He glanced down at the notification, and according to everyone in that room, his entire body went rigid. Mother noticed immediately. "Derek, what is it?" He did not answer. He could not answer. Because at that exact moment, Cousin Brian, who had been scrolling through his phone in the corner, looked up and said words that changed everything. "Holy shit! Is this Megan?" He turned his phone around so everyone could see. CNN's business segment filled the small screen. The anchor's voice cut through the stunned silence of that conference room. Megan Palmer, senior partner at Blackwell and Associates, has led what analysts are calling the most impressive family business rescue of the year. A $100 million acquisition that saved over 200 jobs and positioned the struggling manufacturer for long-term growth. The screen showed me speaking at a podium, confident and composed, my name and title displayed clearly beneath my face. Senior partner, Blackwell and Associates. The woman they had laughed at 2 days ago for only being able to afford small things. The bank representative cleared his throat. "Palmer," he said slowly, "is she related to your family?" No one answered. Mother's hands were shaking. Derek looked like he might be physically ill. Every word coming from that tiny phone screen contradicted everything he had told them about me for years. The struggling company, the unstable career, the sister who could only afford small things. All of it exposed as lies in less than 60 seconds of cable news. Derek tried to recover. "This must be recent," he said, his voice strained. "When I last checked on her company, they were struggling. Things must have turned around quickly." But Mother was not looking at the phone anymore. She was looking at Derek. And her voice when she spoke had a quality I had never heard before. "Doubt. You told me her company was failing, Derek. 2 years ago, after that conference in New York. You said you talked to people who knew her. You said they told you she was barely holding on." Derek stammered something about misunderstandings, about information changing, about how these things happen in business. But the damage was done. I learned later that Mother stared at him for a long moment without speaking, and something shifted in her face. The first crack in 32 years of unconditional trust, the bank representative, sensing the family drama unfolding before him, quietly suggested a 15-minute break. I was still in my Chicago office when my phone rang that afternoon. I looked at the caller ID and felt my heart rate increase. Mother. I had been expecting this call. I had been preparing for it since I walked out of that dining room 2 nights ago. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Her voice was tight with shock and something else. Shame, maybe. Or the beginning of it. Megan, she said. Megan, why did you never tell us about your work? Why did you never say anything about what you do? I let the silence stretch for a moment before responding. My tone was professional, controlled. The same voice I used in boardrooms and negotiations. I did tell you, Mom. Multiple times over the years. Every time I got a promotion, every time I closed a major deal, I told you. You just did not believe me, or you did not want to believe me. She started to protest, to explain, to make excuses. I cut her off. But that is not why I am calling, I said. I should tell you something important. Blackwell has been evaluating Palmer Hardware for the past month. Your company appeared on our distressed asset list. I have seen all the financials, Mom. I know exactly how bad things are. I know about the $3 million in debt. I know about the failed expansion. I know about every mistake Derek has made and tried to hide. We have been considering whether Palmer Hardware is worth saving. The silence on the other end was absolute. I continued. I am willing to meet with the family to discuss options, but not as your daughter, as a potential investor. Someone who might be interested in acquiring the company and restructuring it properly, Mother's voice cracked. Megan, we are family. You cannot just treat us like some business deal. This is your father's company, your grandfather's legacy. I felt something cold settle in my chest. You decided I was not really family when you laughed in my face 2 days ago, I said. When you told me I could only afford small things. When Derek called my expertise amateur involvement. You made that decision, not me. I am offering you a business opportunity now. A chance to save the company and protect the employees who depend on it. I suggest you take it. She tried to argue, to appeal to bonds that she herself had severed years ago. I listened without responding. Then I added one more thing. Before any meeting happens, I need to speak with Harold. Mother sounded confused. Harold? Our Harold. Why would you need to talk to him? Because Harold was loyal to Dad, I said. And I think Dad told him things he never told anyone else. Things I need to understand before I decide how to move forward. That evening, I called Harold at his home. He answered on the second ring, as if he had been waiting. His voice was cautious, at first uncertain. But when he heard my name, when he really heard the pain beneath my professional calm, something in him seemed to break open. Miss Megan, he said carefully, there are things you should know, things your father wanted to tell you before he passed, things about that debt 8 years ago, and things about your brother. I sat down slowly, my heart pounding. Tell me everything, I said. And he did. For over an hour, Harold told me secrets he had carried for 8 years. He told me that my father had discovered the truth about who paid that $800,000 debt. He told me that father had wept and sworn to tell Mother immediately. And he told me why that never happened. Because Derek had intervened. Derek had convinced father to wait. Derek had made sure the right moment never came. When Harold finished speaking, I sat in silence for a long time. The pieces were finally falling into place. 8 years of invisibility. 8 years of being dismissed and diminished. It had not been accident or ignorance. It had been strategy. My own brother had built walls around me, brick by brick, lie by lie, to make sure I remained invisible forever. I asked Harold to be present at the family meeting. He agreed without hesitation. I have been waiting 8 years for permission to tell the truth, he said quietly. I think your father would want me to finally tell it. 3 days later, I walked into the Palmer Hardware conference room with my legal team beside me. Mother sat at the head of the table, looking older than I had ever seen her. Derek was pale and rigid, avoiding my eyes. Harold sat quietly in the corner, carrying 8 years of secrets he was finally ready to share. But there was something else on that table. Something I had not expected. A sealed envelope from my father's estate attorney, marked with instructions in my father's own handwriting. To be opened in the event of acquisition proceedings, bankruptcy filing, or family dispute regarding Palmer Hardware's future. I stared at that envelope and I felt my father's presence in the room for the first time in 3 years. I forced myself to look away from the envelope and focus on why I was here. There would be time for my father's words later. Right now, I had a family to confront and a company to save. I nodded to my legal team, and one of them connected a laptop to the conference room's display screen. Financial records appeared wire transfers from 8 years ago totaling $800,000. The transfers were traced through a shell company and back to accounts bearing my name. Mother stared at the screen without comprehension. Derek stared at it with growing horror. Before we discuss acquisition terms, I said, my voice steady and professional, let us establish some history. 8 years ago, this company was 3 weeks from bankruptcy. A debt of $800,000 was about to destroy everything our grandfather built. Someone paid that debt anonymously. I paused, looking directly at my mother. Who was it? Mother answered, automatically reciting the story she had believed for nearly a decade. An investor. Your father said it was a former business partner who wished to remain anonymous. He never told us the name. I let the silence stretch for a moment. Then I spoke the words I had waited 8 years to say. That anonymous investor was me. The room went absolutely still. I clicked to the next slide, displaying documentation that left no room for doubt. The mortgage records for my grandmother's apartment showing the $350,000 loan I had taken against it. Bank statements showing my savings account depleted from $150,000 to nearly zero, the $200,000 inheritance gone. And finally, a loan agreement with Marcus Webb showing the remaining $100,000 with a 5-year repayment schedule that I had completed 3 years ago. I gave everything I had, I said quietly, every dollar my grandmother left me, every penny I had saved. I borrowed from my mentor and spent 5 years paying him back. I did all of this anonymously because I did not want recognition. I just wanted to save our family. Mother's face had gone pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was Harold who broke the silence, his voice rough with 8 years of held-back truth. She is telling the truth, Mrs. Palmer. I was there when your husband discovered it. He traced the payment through bank records about 3 months after the debt was paid. When he realized what Miss Megan had done, he wept. He told me my daughter saved this entire family and no one will ever know. He swore he would tell you. He intended to tell you immediately. Mother turned to Harold, confusion and dawning horror mixing on her face. But he never told me. Why would he keep something like this secret? Why would he not tell me? Harold took a deep breath. For a moment, he looked older than his 63 years. Then he turned and looked directly at Derek, because Derek convinced him not to. The temperature in that room dropped 10 degrees. I watched my brother's face drain of color. Mother slowly turned to look at her son, the golden child, the one she had championed and protected for 32 years. Harold continued, his voice, quiet but firm. Derek overheard your husband telling me about Miss Megan's sacrifice. The next day, Derek went to Mr. Palmer privately. He told your husband that revealing the truth would humiliate you, Mrs. Palmer. He said it would force you to confront how you had treated Megan all those years. He said it would destroy the family. He suggested waiting for the right moment to tell you. Derek's voice was strained, desperate. I was trying to protect the family. I was trying to protect Mom from feeling guilty. I was just trying to help. Harold shook his head slowly. You were protecting yourself. You made sure that right moment never came. You were always there whenever your father might have spoken privately with your mother. Always finding reasons to delay. Always steering conversations away from Megan. And then your father died, and the secret died with him. Very convenient for you. Mother was staring at Derek like she had never seen him before. Like a stranger had somehow taken the place of her beloved son. I turned to face Derek directly. And after the New York conference 2 years ago, I said, tell us what you told Mother about my company. Tell her what you said after you saw me deliver a keynote speech to 300 industry professionals. Derek was pale now, cornered with nowhere left to hide. Mother's voice cut through the silence, dangerous in a way I had never heard before. You told me her company was failing, she said slowly. You told me you had spoken to people who knew her situation. You said she might not have a job by the end of the year. You said I should not take anything she offered seriously because she was just trying to feel important. Harold spoke again. After that conference, Derek came to me. He asked questions about Miss Megan, her position, her reputation, her future at the firm. I told him the truth. I told him she was being considered for partner, one of the youngest in the firm's history. He told me to keep that information private. Harold paused, his eyes hard. Then I learned that he told Mrs. Palmer the exact opposite. Mother stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She faced Derek, and I saw something I had never witnessed in 36 years. My mother looking at her son with something other than adoration. "You lied to me," she said, her voice cracking. "For years. You made me believe my daughter was a failure. You made me laugh at her. You made me dismiss her. You made me into someone who could not even see her own child." Her voice rose. "From what, Derek? What were you protecting me from? From knowing my daughter was successful, from being proud of her, from being a decent mother." Derek tried to speak, tried to explain, but Mother cut him off. "What else have you lied about? What else?" I allowed the silence to settle over the room before continuing. My tone was clinical, now professional. "This was business. Here are Blackwell's terms," I said. "We will acquire 70% controlling interest in Palmer Hardware. All 47 employees will retain their positions. Their jobs are not negotiable. Mother will receive 20% in preferred shares, which means dividends but no voting rights. Derek will receive 10% under the same terms." I paused, watching Derek's face. He may remain employed in an operations role that matches his actual demonstrated competence. However, there is a condition. He must remain with the company for a minimum of 2 years to assist with the transition. If he leaves before that period ends, he forfeits his entire 10% stake. Derek looked up sharply. He understood immediately. This was a trap. Stay and face daily humiliation working beneath people who knew exactly what he had done. Or leave and lose everything. Walk away with nothing to show for 32 years of being the favorite. I met his eyes without flinching. "You spent 8 years making sure I had no choices," I said. "Now you have 2. Choose wisely." Mother sank back into her chair, looking broken. "Megan," she said quietly, "if I had not laughed that night, if I had listened to you, would you have offered better terms?" I considered her question for a long moment. "You had 36 years to give me a chance, Mom. You never did. But here is the thing. You were not working alone." I glanced at Derek. "You were fed lies for years by someone you trusted completely. The question is not what I would have done differently. The question is, why did it take losing everything for you to finally see me?" Before anyone could respond, the estate attorney cleared his throat from the video screen. "Before we proceed with signatures," he said, "there is one final matter. Mr. Palmer left a sealed letter with specific instructions." He held up an aged envelope for the camera to see. "The conditions he specified have been met. To be opened in the event of acquisition proceedings, bankruptcy filing, or significant family dispute regarding Palmer Hardware's future." He read the handwriting on the envelope aloud. "For Megan, when the truth finally matters." The attorney looked into the camera. "Miss Palmer, your father wrote this letter 8 years ago, right after he discovered what you did for this family." I stared at that envelope on the screen, and I felt tears threatening for the first time since I had walked into this room. The estate attorney emailed the scanned letter to my legal team, and they quietly handed me a laptop and stepped out of the conference room to give me privacy. I appreciated that. Some things should not be witnessed by strangers. I opened the file with trembling fingers. My father's handwriting filled the screen, and for a moment I could not breathe. I had not seen his handwriting in 3 years. Seeing it now felt like hearing his voice from beyond the grave. "Megan," the letter began, "I am not writing to tell you I am proud of you. You have always known that, even when I was too cowardly to say it publicly. I am writing to apologize. I failed you. For your entire life, I watched your mother treat you as an afterthought, and I chose silence because I was afraid of conflict. I told myself I was keeping the peace. But there is no peace in injustice. There is only quiet cruelty, and I was complicit in it. When I discovered you saved this company, that you sacrificed everything you had to rescue a family that never saw you, I was so ashamed I could not speak. You deserve to be celebrated. Instead, I let myself be convinced to stay silent. Derek said it would humiliate your mother. I told myself he was right, but the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of the confrontation. Afraid of what it would mean about the years I had already wasted. Afraid of admitting that my silence had made me part of the problem. I let you carry burdens alone that should have been shared. I let you stay invisible when you deserved to shine. And then I ran out of time. If you are reading this, it means someone is trying to take control of the company, and you are probably involved. Good, You should be. You are the only one in this family who ever truly understood what Palmer Hardware could be. I have only one request. Do what you believe is right. Not what preserves peace, not what makes people comfortable, what is just, what is true. I loved you every single day of your life, Megan. I am sorry I was too weak to show it when it mattered. Your father, William. There was a postscript at the bottom. Do not be too hard on your mother. She never knew the full picture, and much of that is my fault. But do not silence yourself to spare anyone's feelings ever again. Not even family. Especially not family. I read the letter twice. 3 times. I did not cry exactly. But something tight in my chest, something I had carried for decades, finally loosened. My father saw me. He had always seen me. He was weak, yes. He failed me, yes. But he saw me. And in the end, he found a way to tell me. When I looked up, I realized Mother had been reading over my shoulder. Tears were streaming down her face, not for sympathy, but from the accumulated weight of everything she had not known. My father's words indicted her gently but unmistakably, and they confirmed that Derek's manipulation had run even deeper than anything revealed in that meeting. She turned to look at her son, and I saw no recognition in her eyes. She was looking at a stranger. Derek stared at the table, destroyed not by anything I had done, but by his own father's posthumous testimony. The favorite son undone by the words of the man who had tried so hard to love him despite everything. The acquisition closed within 60 days. Professional management took over operations, implementing the restructuring plans I had developed with my team. All 47 employees kept their jobs. Harold was promoted to senior advisor, a title he would hold until his retirement the following year. Derek stayed. He had no choice, really. The forfeiture clause meant that leaving before 2 years would cost him his entire 10% stake. Even diminished, that stake was worth more than his pride. So he remained as operations coordinator, 3 levels below his former position as CEO, reporting to people who had once reported to him. The cost was paid daily. His former business contacts stopped returning his calls. His MBA classmates whispered about him at alumni events, the guy who sabotaged his own sister. His girlfriend of 3 years ended their relationship 2 months after the meeting. If you could lie to your own mother for 8 years, she told him, I do not know who you really are. But the most devastating consequence came from Mother herself. She did not yell at Derek. She did not accuse him or punish him overtly. She simply stopped calling him every day, stopped asking about his work or his life, stopped believing anything he said without independent verification. For Derek, who had built his entire identity on being the favored child, this absence was worse than any anger. The pedestal he had stood on for 32 years had crumbled, and Mother had stopped trying to rebuild it. Mother retained her 20% shares, but she lost everything else. Her identity as the family matriarch who had built Palmer Hardware alongside my father collapsed under the weight of truth. Her social circle learned the broad strokes of what had happened. Such things do not stay secret in small business communities. They knew her daughter had rescued the company twice. They knew her son had driven it toward ruin. They knew she had laughed at the wrong child. She and I speak occasionally now. Brief cordial calls on holidays. No tearful reconciliation. No dramatic forgiveness scene. Just 2 people acknowledging they are related while maintaining careful distance. Once she sent me a text message. I am seeing a therapist, she wrote, trying to understand how I became someone who could not see her own daughter. I read the message. I did not respond. I do not owe my mother a redemption arc. But I did not block her either. Some doors can stay open without inviting anyone through. 6 months after the acquisition, Palmer Hardware posted its strongest quarter in a decade. Harold sends me monthly updates, even now. The employees wanted you to know, he wrote in his last email. They remember who saved their jobs. Both times. I smile when I read these messages. I saved 47 families from unemployment. I honored my father's legacy. I broke free from a system that was designed to keep me small. And I did it without becoming cruel, without seeking revenge for its own sake, without burning everything down simply because I could have. My Chicago apartment is quiet these days, but it is a peaceful quiet. On the shelf beside my window sits a framed photograph of me and my father at my college graduation, one of the few times he publicly celebrated me. Beside it hangs his letter, also framed. Some nights I read it again, not for the apology, for the permission. Do what you believe is right. I did. It is evening now. Winter light fades over the Chicago skyline, painting the buildings in shades of purple and gold. I stand by my window with a glass of wine in my hand, watching the city settle into darkness. My phone buzzes on the counter behind me. I glance at the screen, a text from an unknown number, but I know who it is. Derek. Probably another attempt at contact, at explanation, at reconciliation. I do not open it. I look back at the skyline, instead take a slow sip of wine and smile. Not triumphantly, peacefully. The silence is not empty anymore. It is mine. I chose it. I earned it. And for the first time in 36 years, it feels like home. And so Megan's story comes to an end, but the lessons it carries stay with us long after the final words fade. This is a story about invisibility, about being the person who gives everything and receives nothing in return, about standing in a room full of family and feeling like a stranger. If any part of Megan's journey resonated with you, I want you to know something important. You are not alone. So many of us have sat at dinner tables where our accomplishments were dismissed, where our sacrifices went unnoticed, where the people who were supposed to love us the most seemed to see us the least. But here's what Megan's story teaches us. Silence is not nobility. For years, Megan believed that staying quiet about her achievements was the humble thing to do. She thought that eventually her family would see her worth without her having to prove it. She was wrong. Some people will never see you unless you demand to be seen. And demanding to be seen is not arrogance, it is survival. The second lesson is equally important. You cannot control how others treat you, but you can control how long you allow it to continue. Megan spent 36 years hoping her mother would change, hoping Derek would mature, hoping that one day someone would recognize what she had done for them. That hope cost her decades of peace. The moment she stopped hoping and started acting was the moment everything changed. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stop waiting for people who will never show up. There is also a painful truth in this story about family loyalty. We are taught from childhood that family comes first, that blood is thicker than water, that we must forgive and forget because these are the people who share our name. But Megan's story shows us the dark side of that belief. Derek weaponized family loyalty for 8 years. He used his mother's trust to build a prison of lies around his sister. And mother, blinded by her preference for her son, became an unwitting accomplice in her daughter's erasure. Family loyalty should never be a one-way street. It should never require you to shrink yourself so others can feel tall. Perhaps the most powerful lesson comes from Megan's father, William. His letter reveals a truth that many of us need to hear. Staying silent in the face of injustice makes you complicit in it. William loved his daughter. He saw her. He was proud of her. But his fear of conflict kept him quiet, and that silence allowed the unfairness to continue for decades. If you see someone being mistreated, especially within your own family, your silence is not neutrality. It is a choice, and it is the wrong one. Finally, this story teaches us about the difference between revenge and justice. Megan did not destroy her family out of spite. She did not burn Palmer Hardware to the ground, even though she had every right to feel that temptation. Instead, she saved 47 jobs. She honored her father's legacy. She held Derek accountable without becoming cruel. She showed that strength does not require cruelty, and that justice does not require destruction. To everyone listening who has ever felt invisible, who has ever been laughed at by the people who should have believed in you, who has ever wondered if your sacrifices would ever be recognized, I hope Megan's story gives you courage. You deserve to be seen. You deserve to take up space. And you deserve to stop shrinking yourself for people who refuse to make room for you. If this story touched your heart, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever felt invisible in your own family? How did you find the strength to demand recognition? Your stories matter, and sharing them might help someone else who is struggling right now. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to our channel and clicking the notification bell so you never miss another story. We share new stories every week, stories about resilience, justice, and the quiet strength of people who refuse to be overlooked. Thank you for listening. Until next time, remember, your worth is not determined by those who fail to see it.